Today I'm going to try and explain one really abstract thing that my programmer, I don't know if I can explain it. Then I'm also going to try and address a thing with the people I'm doing this vlogging challenge with. And then finally, I've got this now really old donut in here. I figured out a way to make it taste like new. Come on. Come on, camera. There we go. So, I'm doing this vlogging challenge. There's two other people, Travis and Gabby. Their channel is When You're With Me. And they have stopped posting videos, so I asked them, hey, what's up? And here's the TLDR, as Travis wrote it. Pretty much there's a forced feeling when it comes to this particular 30-day challenge that is, in parentheses, personally, difficult to adhere to, especially to Gabby. As for why it's so difficult, it's probably how easy it is to get distracted by everyday mundane things. And then in parentheses, this is me personally. That feel important at the time, but probably not in the long run. It's a hard habit to break. It's really stunting when trying something new. And so, I've kind of got three things to say to that. The first is, the way that I know how to relate to this most is actually on programming projects. So when a thing starts out, everybody's all happy. They're like, oh, we're gonna make this great, it's gonna be awesome. There's this initial burst of energy, and then it dies. And then you realize, oh, I actually have to build it. Then you start hitting the hard parts. Then you have to start communicating delays. Actually, not that often, luckily. But you start having to deal with the reality of it. And so that doesn't make it any less valuable. That doesn't make it any less worth doing, but it changes how you feel about doing it. And so usually when that moment crops up, when the moment when I want to stop doing something crops up, the hardest thing for me to realize is that it's happening, because there's an emotion that doesn't really exist in English, American culture, that kind of stuff. Doesn't really exist that much. People automatically run into barriers, and then they start thinking like, they start going sour, they start becoming negative, not talking with themselves correctly, or in ways that benefit them that they initially wanted to. And so there's this emotion called resistance, where the world is not as you wish it was. And so resistance itself is not a good thing, it's not a bad thing. It's simply feedback that the world is different than the way that you wish it was. And so usually my mistake, the reason that knowing that it's there is so important, is when resistance crops up, I go and I attach a bunch of emotions to it. I start getting like, oh man, this sucks, like losing ambition, lost the energy, lost the verve. Like all these excuses come out that are basically value judgments on myself, because I'm attaching all this negative energy to the resistance that I'm feeling. And so resistance is not itself good or bad. And so here's another quote from Marcus Aurelius that I really like, because it explains it. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. There's a whole book about this actually called The Obstacle is the Way, which is good. But basically what that speaks to is resistance is there. This is the second point. Resistance is there as feedback for you. Resistance is like, your conscious brain can tell you to do stuff, but the vast majority of you is unconscious. It's things that you do every day. And so a lot of your unconscious is tuned and primed by what your conscious brain thinks, both what you think, how much energy you attach to it, and then how, like, both the intensity and the volume. So like in this message, Travis is saying it's so easy to get distracted by mundane things that feel important at the time but probably aren't in the long run. Like, this is really hard. Well, yeah, it is, because you're changing yourself. that is really hard. And so the way through is to recognize that you're just feeling resistance. The world is not as you wish it was. So how do you wish that the world was? Why do you wish it is that way? The resistance is created as a result of a story that you're telling yourself that doesn't match up with the feedback that you're getting from the world. So one of the two needs to be readjusted. And usually the right answer is to readjust the story that you're telling yourself, the project that you're working on, the things that you're doing, to reframe the feedback that you're getting from the real world to be constructive. And so in this case, there's no deeper importance. There's just the feeling that this thing is like a chore. Well, why does it feel like a chore? What would make it not feel like a chore? How could you change it so it wasn't a thing that felt unimportant in the moment or whatever? And so then that question kind of boils into, so where do you get, what makes you happy? And then how can you change this thing so it will give you that happiness? It will produce this for you, because then you'll do it more. How can you make it so this is a thing that you don't resist? So the resistance is actually extremely useful feedback on what you need to change and where. The hard part is recognizing that, one, resistance is happening, two, that you're telling yourself a story that isn't constructive, and then the last part is rewriting that. Because if you're the one who's making yourself unhappy, then you're also the one who can make yourself happy. So that's a holistic answer to it. Usually when I run into this on a programming project, the best thing is to just like chill out, like go do something else and then come back to it later. Like understand it really isn't that important. Or if it's on deadline, like earlier in this vlog, I went through a really unhealthy mental time because I thought I was on a big deadline that I actually wasn't. But I had to get a ton of work done really quickly. I couldn't avoid it. So the right answer was to just brutally police my conscious thinking. And I didn't do that at first, and I did some really dumb things. And then once I was just like, wait, no, you're doing this again, Chris. Catching it, then like you say the words, and at first they feel fake, but you're going through the motions. Then you start getting some good feedback, you power those words, and then eventually like you get it done. And so that's kind of my bigger picture response without any hopeful specific solutions. But it's an interesting phenomenon when you want to try something new and then you get stuck. I also just heard this, that the word interesting is really lazy, and that the word interesting doesn't itself mean anything. So I just said it, but I want to use it again already. I might try to not use it. Anytime I'd use it, rephrase in some different way. I have the same pet peeve when people say something is good. They'll be like, oh yeah, that movie was so good. It's like, why was it good? Why did you like it? Why might I like it? Like, there's all these like wonderful details that I just never get dug into because people just wrap it up in this meaningless bag statement where they just say, oh yeah, it was so good. If you want to take an old crusty donut and make it taste like new, this is a strategy that I devised yesterday. Put it in the microwave. Really only needs to be there 30 seconds. Boom. Microwave it until the glass itself is like steamy, foggy. What is this red stuff? That's disgusting. It's not like carrots or something. I don't know. Anyway, so now the inside of your microwave is all filled with water vapor. You've got a hot water thing in there. Take your donut, put it on a plate, put it in there, and then keep microwaving. So hopefully I can catch this. This is kind of a delicate thing because if you leave it in there too long, the frosting will start melting down the sides, and you don't want that. But this will infuse all the dough, all the frosting, everything with water vapor again. That'll make it really chewy and good. And then of course, because you're microwaving it, it'll make it warm too. So, life pro tip, I guess. There we go. So when I put it in there, it was pretty stiff and stale. Now it's nice and warm and bendy and chewy and good. I just recorded a bunch of stuff trying to attack that abstract idea, and I'm pretty sure it's all terrible. So before I get done on this little stint, I'm going to try and explain it again. Actually, there are a bunch of questions, and it's a very specific line of reasoning. I haven't internalized it that deeply yet, so I'm going to need to refer to some stuff that I wrote down on my computer. But to start out, one of the most useful the first two questions that are useful to ask is, what does the best programmer look like? How do they operate? Why? What do they do? And then the other thing is, what actually is code? And so these sound like really, really simple questions, but they might not. But like, I grapple with them a lot. So my current best answer is that like the absolute best a programmer can be is someone who's not so much a programmer, but somebody who's able to interpret and communicate the process of the real world in software. So this has an important consideration that arises from it, and it's that the important act of the programmer centers around what they select from the world and then how they represent it. And so this brings up the second question, which is, how do they represent it? Well, in code. So what is code? And right now, the simple answer might be code is just everything that's stored as text. It's just a bunch of text on a screen or something. But I actually think that code is two things. It's messages that are being sent, that are set up to be able to be sent like at will, kind of, for two audiences. And so maybe I say messages, maybe a better way of phrasing this is it's thought. It's thought put down and solidified in an external way that is no longer in a human's head. But it's actually got two audiences. It's talking with the computer, and then it's also talking with people. Either the same programmer or other programmers, whatever. So two different audiences. And the thing is, a lot of the time, what code that talks really well to a computer looks like is completely unintelligible to a human. So oftentimes, or at least this is the case right now, clarity for one audience comes at the expense of clarity for the other. So I'm kind of assuming that these things are true, and I'm not going to go back deeper than that right now, but just assuming that they're true, then one of the most important implementation questions becomes, so what is the, if you have to talk with both these audiences, maybe they shouldn't be the same thing, but right now they are. Like, code is written and it talks to both ends. But there's an implementation concern that becomes like extremely profound. It becomes the right question. And the right question is, what is the smallest thing that could be universal and allow everything else to happen? So that's the right thing to code. In a given system, it's finding the simplicity in it and then putting that in code. It's putting that so it can talk with people and talk with software. It's when you find the simplicity that you actually understand the thing. And so to this end, there's this there's some terms that get thrown around a lot that I'm going to be using, but I'm not going to be using in the way that they get thrown around. One of those terms is object-oriented programming, and then another one of those terms is data. And so I guess another thing I should explain is functional programming, but basically I will sort of be talking about these things, but I'm not actually talking about them the way that people typically use them. And so the question then arises, so what is the smallest thing that can explain everything else? What's the thing that can take care of it all? Because that's the thing you actually want to implement. Well, really, if you're just talking between some different audiences for different ends, what you're actually doing is you're sending messages. And so way, way, way deep down, if you have to represent the world, parts of the world on a computer, how do you do that? I think way deep down, even not necessarily on computers. This kind of expands more out into how the world works. Things happen where you have this is where I think all of it breaks down, because you have an object, and an object is a hard concept to explain. But basically what an object is, it's because it's so arbitrary. So an object is anything that you say is an object that can be like kind of reasonably categorized as a thing. So like me, I would count as an object. If I was in a computer, then I would be an object. So if I wanted to send something to somebody else and they were in the computer too, they would be a different object. I'd be sending them a message. And so then that begs the question, okay, so if that's the case, that like deep down, that's kind of how things have to work in some sense, because what you run up against is, so when they're sending messages around, what is it that they're sending? Where is the meaning in the system created? And like, what is most scarce? What is most scarce is meaning. Where is meaning created? And the meaning is created when, not when I send the message, not what I intend to do when I send it, but when somebody else actually receives the message and decides what it means. So it's the interpretation of it that is actually where all the rest of the meaning is created, where all the rest of the value of the entire system is derived. So this is really abstract. One more abstract bit and then I'll go into a more concrete example. But the other thing is this notion of data. So if I send a message to somebody and they receive it, this notion of data is that there's this thing, there's like the text in this message that is data. It exists on its own, and it kind of has, it's like an observation, a measurement, or just information about something at one specific point in time, and it's got sufficient like formatting and metadata to say what it is. And so data, data, however you say it, it's this concept that in popular culture, here's a thing that sits on its own. Like, let's look at the data. Let's look at blah, 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 blah. Like, because it is objective. It is simply a signal that gives out, and then it is a constant kind of thing. And I've actually come to the point of view of thinking that like this idea of data, as I've just explained it, what if data is a really bad idea? And so an example of that might be, and when I say a really bad idea, I mean it's really harmful because it prevents a programmer from building a system the way that would be best. And so I'll explain with a more concrete example. So take a stream of readings from a thermostat or a thermometer in your house, like you probably got one somewhere. So like 74 degrees Fahrenheit. These are sent out, stored on a disk somewhere, you can look at it on your phone, that kind of stuff. Suddenly, all these numbers begin to plummet. It goes from 74 to 70, 66, 62, all the way down to like 20 degrees or something crazy. Well, does your thermostat know that your heater broke and it's in the middle of winter? Does the disk that store them understands that that's what it's saying? That's what the bits that it holds, that's what they mean? Like, do either of these things actually understand the data? Well, no, because it only makes sense when you see it, and then you start realizing like, oh no, my heater's broken. Why is it 20 degrees in my house? So when you finally interpret it. And so if you take this notion of data as its own objective thing that simply gives off a signal, but that it has constant meaning, so it's this definition of data that's harmful, and it's because it's not exactly that tamped down. So I don't know how to explain it too well, especially not in speech, but like the argument would be, there's a bunch of these numbers, there's a bunch of these readings that are on a disk. This is the data. Well, I don't think like this, no, they're just messages. They're just messages between two different objects. Because how do the bits know that they're bits? How do the numbers know that they're even supposed to be numbers? How do they even know what they relate to? Like, what's this Fahrenheit thing? And so if you're recursively question, so you take a thing, then you go further inside of it, and you take another thing and you keep asking the same question all the way down. How does it know what it is? Where is the meaning created? Where is the meaning derived? As you keep going further and further down, when a message is sent, there simply has to be a process that extracts a signal from the noise. And so it's the interpretation of the message by the second object. So like you looking at your phone, seeing the drop in temperature, that's the true impact of the message. And so what if it was wrong? What if the readings were totally wrong and your house is totally fine? It's the same like sort of data, but it means something completely different. What if you've gotten a call from somebody who said, hey, somebody broke your window? Like, it could be objectively about the same event, but it could be communicated a variety of different ways. So, like, the message that is sent and the process that extracts from the message is entirely material to the entire occurrence itself. So like that is where the meaning's created. That is where all the importance rests. So when you're building systems, it needs to be built upon this principle too, not this idea that data is this immutable thing. Sorry, bad word. It's often useful to be immutable, but it's not this like common idea of data. No, everything is mediated by objects that send messages to each other. Like this is actually how the world works all the way down. And so the quote that I got in my major, in my like college major, the quote that was said quite often is, the medium is the message. So what does this mean? Well, this is the same thing I just explained in a different way. If I send somebody a text and then I call somebody and I say the exact same thing, going back to like my original example, hey, I caught this fish. Well, it could be communicating the exact same data in some fashion down there in the message itself, but a call, the way that the message is extracted is much different than a text, the way that the meaning is extracted and interpreted by the person who gets it. So that means that if you send something over a different medium, it becomes a fundamentally different message because all of it hinges upon this final part. And so in that way, data is always semantically defined by the objects using it and interpreting it. And thus, systems need to be designed around how do these objects work and what are the messages that are sent in between them. And so, I'm still grappling with this. I still honestly go back and forth on this. Without explicit technical details, like being able to show you this, like it's a really big abstract tower. But when it like really boils down to it, when you keep questioning how and why does the world work, how does it need to be represented, everything can be explained by that. And so therefore that becomes the most important thing to implement because it can explain everything else. So when it comes to broader communication, broader systems, it's the reception of messages by different objects and then all the messages that they send out as a result that defines the meaning of the system. That's what defines the meaning of the software. When you build something, it's the messages that are sent that are the most important thing, both within the software to communicate with other people, with the computer, but then also to make sure that it does what it's supposed to do. So it's not this idea of data. And so I've gone back and forth on this, but there's a lot of holes in this argument, I think. I don't know where they are yet. I'm still grappling with this a lot. I've gone back and forth. This is like an issue of core faith for me. And that might sound weird, but the thing about computers is that, and software, is the other thing that I'd consider them to be most like is rhetoric. So musty old Greek and Roman guys speaking and stuff, like it's not a tool that you use for its own sake, it's a tool that you use to accomplish other things. So if to accomplish those other things you have to represent them, then you have to understand how they are so you can represent the right bits in the most simple way. And so this all, like, I hope I did this some justice. I'll probably watch this in another year and be like, what were you talking about? And then there's probably some bits in here that aren't totally right. But it's this idea, this is how things should be built, this is how things should be viewed. Anytime there's a deviation from that, something else is treated a different way, I think it's a fundamental flaw in the approach, and that the lack of approaching computers this way is actually one of the biggest and significant fundamental flaws in the industry, and it's been crippling us and holding us back. And so what I'm interested in doing is really understand the argument that I'm trying to make here first, making sure that like more or less it's right. The way I want to do that is by demonstrating it, by being a practitioner of it. So that is kind of like one of the weird thought paths that I will go down on a given day. I've been recording for 15 minutes now, so that's it. That's today.